tonight I wanted to focus on a period that's extremely well known in general discourse, but in terms of British Jewish-Muslim relations, it's probably fair to say that it's lesser known. And the period I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to share my screen. So what I'm actually going to do tonight is to look at the period roughly 1933 to 42, but inevitably I will start with a bit of context beforehand, and I will also kind of move on just beyond 1942 with a little bit of a postscript. So essentially, I'm going to start by picking up where I left off 20 months ago. So in my talk in March 2021, I was looking at the first decade of the 20th century, and I was particularly focusing on the very significant interactions that were predominantly led by William Henry Abdullah Quilliam, famous convert to Islam, who ran the Liverpool Muslim Institute until its closure in 1908. He had significant dealings with Anglo Jewry. Really, he traveled up and down the country to speak to Jewish audiences and indeed nascent Zionist meetings. What's really interesting about Quilliam is after he left Liverpool in 1908 to visit the Ottoman Empire, to Turkey, where he had a personal relationship with Sultan Abdul Hamid, he was embroiled in something of a legal scandal from his own work. And then as he was there was the Young Turk Revolution. And for various reasons, when he came back to Britain, he took on a new identity of Dr. Henri Marcel Lyon, who may have actually been a Jewish convert to Islam himself, and he probably had been the family doctor to the Quilliams. Either way, it was the same person, but Lyon, as he became known, continued these really significant relationships with Anglo Jewry. For example, there was a society of philology, arts and science where, for example, Lyon Quilliam, whatever you wish to call him, worked with some very predominant Orthodox and liberal rabbis within Anglo Jewry, and none other than Lord Rothschild himself. So that takes us up to the First World War. And of course, with the shifting geopolitical strands because of the war, particularly the kind of decline of the Ottoman Empire and then sort of British control in Israel and in Palestine, there was a big shift from 1917 onwards. And within the Anglo-Jewish community and indeed within British Muslim communities as well, you can sense that there was a flashpoint over what was going to happen in what became the British Mandate of Palestine. And I think the key issue, and this is one that has so much contemporary resonance, is that, essentially, could international events and tensions abroad, can they, however much tension they cause at that place, can they be transcended in a local context, indeed here in Britain? And we also have to consider in the 20s and 30s Britain's imperial perspective and its empire, because again, there were over 300 million Muslims who were part of the British Empire. So all of these factors are interwoven. It's worth just saying before I go on that during the interwar period, so if we look in the beginning of the 1930s, there is a demographic shift from today. So there were around 340,000 Jewish people living in Britain. And it is roughly estimated by Martin Pugh and others that the Muslim sort of settled community was around 20,000. So of course, demographically, things have shifted significantly since the 1950s and 60s, but we're looking actually at a time where numerically Anglo-Jewry is larger. So moving on, what I'd like to do, and I'm going to hide my thumbnail so you can hopefully see this, I'd like to start with just a bit of background. I'm going to go up to the year 1929, just a little bit before I officially start with what the real point of the talk is with the 30s, because again, I don't want to give a whole historical overview, but the British Mandate in Palestine became official in 1922 after ratification at San Remo. And by 1929, there were tensions brewing within the Mandate. On the eve of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement in 1928, there was a bit of controversy at the Western Wall, where previously Jews were given passage to worship there, but there was some kind of rumors that went round and some misinformation that the Jews were trying to alter the status quo by moving some of the screens and things like that, which they were not technically meant to do. And this happened on the eve of the fast day of Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement. This was misinterpreted through some poor messaging, partly through the British and other things, that essentially, hang on a minute, are the Jews in Palestine trying to alter the status quo? Within 9 months after that, by the summer of 1929, this results, as we're going to see in a minute, in unfortunately some famous attacks in Hebron and other places where around 80, 90 Jews were killed. You can see on the right an image of a shul, a synagogue in Hebron, which was destroyed by an Arab mob. On the left, you can see an image from the 20s of a group of Orthodox Jews praying at the Western Wall, again, under sort of British supervision. So 1929, the reason I'm giving you that little bit of background is that tensions are brewing in the Palestine Mandate, but we have here a Rabbi Dr. Moses Gaster, the Chacham of the British Sephardi congregations. Now, I want to just say a few things about Rabbi Dr. Gaster because he was very much a Turkophile. He was a very big supporter of the Ottoman Empire, and he joined many Muslims present in Britain to found the Anglo-Ottoman Society in the early 1910s, just before the outbreak of the First World War. And Gaster himself moved in many circles, but he was a very, very big supporter of the Ottoman Empire and spoke very highly of what the Ottoman Empire had done for Jews, as did many other of his fellow co-religionists. But as he saw tension brewing, I thought there was something quite interesting here. He wrote a letter to the Times in August 1929, 2 weeks after what I just mentioned, the attacks in Hebron. And he was commenting on some of the comments of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and that would be another talk in and of itself. But the bit I've highlighted in red, and I think it's really interesting, I do not wish to say anything which might affect the susceptibilities of the Mohammedans, essentially that's his terminology for Muslims, among whom I have many friends. And that is no underestimate, because Gaster certainly moved in Muslim circles, as did, as we're going to see later on, many other Jewish ministers of various persuasions. But I venture to say that some of the most important statements made by the Mufti cannot bear any careful examination. They seem to be contrary to fact. So we can see here a bit of a fracturing. But what I think we can also see that's going to be important in the 1930s is that there is this sense of solidarity. It's not a solidarity that is always going to be 100% secure, but it's a solidarity based on tradition, history, and various other things. And so Dr. Gaster, who died in the early 30s, he was a figure who'd certainly struggled to kind of both communities, and we'll come back to that soon. I'd also like to point out a most fascinating Muslim gentleman who, again, is probably lesser known than Quilliam, who I spoke of before, Moshe Hussain Kidwai, who was born in Gadya in India. He trained in law in London. Of course, the empire links. He was able to study in the UK. And this was a gentleman who, in the first few years of the 1900s, he lived in the Maida Vale area of northwest London. And at that time, there was the beginnings of a nascent liberal Jewish congregation around St. John's Wood. In fact, it is still there to this day. And he often commented back in the 1900s, he said, whenever I'm in London, I always feel comfortable eating with Jews because neither of us would ever contemplate touching pig. And he says, I have relationships with Jews of the Orthodox and the liberal persuasion. And yes, he had his concerns. He felt that there was a sort of exclusivism in certain parts of the Jewish community. But he was certainly, like others, and in many ways, like Dr. Gaster, a real Turkophile. He long defended the Ottoman Empire and was, of course, quite saddened by its demise in the early 20s. But if you look here, he wrote to the Jewish Chronicle in 1929, around the same time Gaster wrote to the Times. And I think this is fascinating because it resonates with what so much of what we see today. And he said, and I'm just pointing out the bits, you can read the full with pleasure for yourself, but the bits in red, he says, it pains me to notice the present tension between the Jews and Muslims over a land which is sacred to both. And then he talks about his past attempts to try and kind of got a sort of a cordial, an entente cordiale between Jews and Muslims, both abroad and in Palestine. And in that final paragraph, and this is a real discourse that was extremely popular at the time, the Jews and Muslims have always been friends, and the two communities, by mutual friendship and cooperation, evolved a civilization under the aegis of the caliphs in Spain, referring to the contested concept of the golden age of Spain, again, where there was a tremendous synthesis of Jewish, Muslim, kind of work in terms of culture, philosophy, religion. Obviously, we've got Maimonides, we've got Yehuda Halevi, and it's really interesting, that final point. It's that frustration of seeing, we have this potential of such closeness, but then why cannot they do the same now in a self-governing Palestine? Why? So even at the end of the 20s, there's this feeling that, yes, we have this historical heritage, we have so many commonalities, but we cannot escape the political realities. And that's a really good background for me to go into the 30s, because as we know, the 30s, the geopolitical situation changes rapidly, but some of the commonalities that I've already outlined will continue. And I think what we're going to see within Anglo Jewry is complexity, but also solidarity. And I think that if we have an honest look at some of the sources I'm using, which many of them are excerpts from the Jewish Chronicle, but I'm also going to bring you some of the archival sources I've used from the London Metropolitan Archives, which include records from the Board of Deputies of British Jews in particular, and one or two others, which I'll refer to. So moving on, when we get into the early 1930s, the situation in Mandate Palestine settles down for a while. There is talk within the kind of Labour and McDonnell government about a kind of a new white paper, but essentially, after Hitler's ascension to power in 1933, we actually see an increase in Jewish immigration to Palestine. So that grows to a point where by 1938 or so, there are by that stage around 500,000 Jews living in the Palestine Mandate. And at the beginning of the decade, it was probably around 180, 200,000. So there's a significant extra influx. And again, comment, if you look in the Jewish Chronicle, I suppose you could see it as a mouthpiece of Anglo Jewry, or you could look at it the other way around. But there's a fascinating column in December 1934, and it's a letter of a correspondent who was known as Ben Ami, Muslims and Jews, my dear cousin. And he, in this letter, he underlined the Jewish influence on the Quran, but then he offered a contemporary analysis. And I think this is fascinating because it puts it into the imperial empire context. So the quote that you can see, the 250 million Muslims in the world ought, therefore, to be drawn towards the 16 million Jews. More especially should this be the case in the British Empire. The 77 million Muslims in India should certainly be amicably disposed to the people of the book. Their example is bound to have helpful repercussions in Palestine. And what I think he meant by this is that, yes, we have political problems, there is dissent, there is a fraying of relations, but actually here in the British Empire, we have a unique opportunity of potential togetherness that could lead to a solution. And that sort of spirit is one that is abounds in continuity as we go on. And we'll see a reciprocation on the Muslim side as well. And a fascinating piece of archival evidence I found. In 1935, this is by the year, if we just put a bit of context on it, where essentially Hitler is beginning to publicly rearm the Nazi regime. We'll get to the Nuremberg laws by the summer of 1935, which essentially, further restrictions against German Jews. There was an organization I'd never heard of before until about a year ago, called the Muslim Association of the British Empire. And its president, a gentleman called Ahmed Bennett, sent a very striking letter to the Board of Deputies of British Jews in the spring of 1935. And it was all about, hang on now, why don't we form an official Jewish-Muslim alliance against Nazi Germany? And the way he starts the letter is very interesting because it reflects the common discourse that we've talked about already of the sort of Jewish-Muslim coexistence in historical context, most particularly the kind of, again, the contested example of Spain I've mentioned, but also I think particularly within the Ottoman Empire, where after the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain in 1492, the Ottomans did give a welcome, and places like Salonika became major Jewish centers until the early 20th century. But be that as it may, if you can see for yourself, he mentions Muslim Spain. And he mentions this very common discourse as well, from that Judaism was so much closer to Islam than Christianity. And this is one that had been particularly perpetrated by the German Jewish historian Heinrich Gretz in the late 19th century, mainly for political purposes, in that he was disappointed by the failure of Enlightenment Christian Europe to really enfranchise and treat the Jews as equals. And he looked, in many ways, like others, to the Islamic world and Islamic Spain as what could happen, particularly the Sephardi mystique. But then Bennett goes on, and you start to see that combination of historical solidarity with the political reality of the mid-30s. And I find this fascinating because you'll see within these little underlying potential tropes, but you'll see how they're deployed. Jewry must see where its interests lie, the bit in red, and must realise that Palestine was set up to divide and weaken international Jewry, to stamp the Jew as an alien, and to destroy the 19th century accord between Britain and Jew, to render impossible Muslim-Jewish rapprochement, and to lay the foundation stone of Muslim-Jewish hatred and antagonism. So the issues in Palestine are presented as a potential hindrance, I think say more of a hindrance, a potential tremendous schism for Jewish-Muslim relations. And it's really interesting. So this letter was sent to Neville Lasky, the Board of Deputy President for most of the 1930s. And in his response, he didn't know what to do. He thought, I don't want to divide us in Anglo-Jewry into a political chasm here. So he said, faux pas, he put it, my apologies. And he wanted more information because first he probably didn't know who Ahmed Bennett or the organization were. And Bennett did write back to him with a little bit of the aims of the Muslim Association of the British Empire. And there was an interesting point. He said, my Jewish friends, it's your responsibility to watch the course of events carefully. And if the British government really is a true friend to Anglo-Jewry, they'll speak out against Hitler's Germany. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Ask her to do it. So there's an underlying tone of, you in Anglo-Jewry, you at the British Board of Deputies, you've got a bit of influence. You should be liaising with the government. And again, it is potentially, you could argue, there's a slight underlying trope of, you've got that potential political power, use it. And I think for these reasons, in a way, that actual formal alliance was never generated. I think the board were a little spooked by it all, and I think they didn't quite know how to react. So in a sense, like many initiatives do, it got heard, it got pushed to one side. But that's 1935, and I'm going to argue that 1936 onwards is a major turning point, both politically and ironically, as we're about to see, it's a political turning point within Anglo-Jewish and Muslim relations at a time where the situation in Palestine declines again. So from 1936 to 1939, I've called this section Revolt in Palestine, Solidarity at Home. So in 1936, what started as a general strike led to what became known as the 3-year sort of Arab uprising or revolt, whatever words you want to do with it. And at this stage, the British came in, they used heavy-handed tactics to sort of quell this revolt. The Mufti starts going on the run, ends up in various places. We know eventually he ends up in Baghdad a couple of years later. And the British government, who are thinking, what are we going to do? Is there a solution? They send Lord Peel to Palestine. And in 1937, he publishes his report that suggests partition, the idea of 2 states in one land. And again, we've heard that, and this is a common thing in contemporary speak as well. So Peel says that, but there is definitely this is a moment of real potential problems in Palestine between Arabs and Jews. But yet, at home, I would argue the following, that despite the dissent abroad, if anything, Jews and Muslims in Britain came closer together in those years. And I think there are various factors that explain it. I think it's partly the kind of the wider international context with the growing Nazi threat, which is, again, we'll come to later, and I'm going to try and connect Germany and Britain from a Muslim-Jewish perspective in a minute. But here at St. John's Wood Orthodox Synagogue, and I think this is absolutely fascinating, in May 1937, they invited a Muslim scholar, Dr. Abdul Aziz Puri, to deliver a lecture on Islam and Judaism, their cultural affinity and influence. And we have a report in the Jewish Chronicle, and I think the synagogue's minister, Reverend Harris Swift, firstly, he emphasized just how pro-Jewish the speaker was and how lovely and reassuring it was. And here we have a common refrain we hear today. Just because there is trouble in the Middle East, this should not affect the way that we as Jews and Muslims get on here on a local level in Britain. And again, you notice the way he frames it. Jews should in no way suffer here for the disturbances in Palestine. And how often do we hear this, this conflation between the international and the local? And here in the 30s, there's a real attempt to reach out and actually to establish those relations that would hopefully ensure that things on a more local, national level are better. So I've said here that it's a sense of optimism, but I'd also say from a Jewish perspective here, a latent sense of nervousness that this could go the other way as well. But it doesn't just end there, because whilst many people will think that the 1930s wasn't exactly a heyday of interfaith relations, what we start seeing from 1936 onwards is a real nascent growth, not just in early Christian-Jewish relations, which again, we know with the founding of the Council of Christians and Jews in 1942 is a watershed moment. But actually there's quite a lot else going on that isn't just Jews and Christians, but it's Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, etc. So we have on the eve of war, two fascinating conferences. We've got a religious conference on world peace held at the London Mosque, and featuring contributions from Imam Abdul Majid, who is of the Woking Mosque, and we're going to hear more about him in a few minutes, a fascinating figure who had significant dealings with Anglo Jewry. And you can see, you know, that right on the eve of the war, I think actually on the 1st of September 1939, there was a convention of religions held in Southport. And again, the whole aim of it, there were different speakers, was to promote increased cooperation between religious denominations and to foster that dialogue. So I see that we're in a time of international strife, and there's this concerted effort that we here have a responsibility, a position, and a potential to be able to do something. And so the 1930s is the growth of a nascent interfaith relations, and very much Jewish-Muslim relations was a seminal part of that, although it has often been overshadowed, understandably, you know, when we eventually get to the foundation of the CCJ in 1942. So if you excuse me for a minute, I just want to turn to an international context, because in Anglo Jewry, British Jews were very, very interested in what was going on in Muslim communities, particularly Muslim communities where there was also a Jewish presence. And what they were very worried about was this: how far have the fascist Italian and the Nazi German propaganda, how far has that turned Muslim communities across the globe against Jews? And there was a very famous French Jewish humanitarian, Bernard Lacache, who was the president of the Liga. And in 1937, he began a tour of North Africa. And the Jewish Chronicle recorded this as a 3-part special in the summer of 1937. This took up at least 4 pages an episode. It just shows you how important Muslim-Jewish relations are, that they gave such space to a gentleman who was going to try and hope that Nazi and fascist propaganda had not damaged that previous sort of solidarity. And absolutely fascinating quotes, and I've just picked one up for you. So Lacache talks about his visit to Algeria, and there were some problems. He needed a bit of police escort times. There were some sort of fascist sympathizers in the population that tried to disrupt these interfaith meetings, but they went to a dinner. And I find this fascinating. You've got to remember, so this is the French context. I'll say a bit more soon. So essentially, Algeria was part of the French metropole. Tunisia and Morocco were French protectorates. And there were significant Jewish communities there alongside a Muslim majority. And you've also got within there in the mix a lot of French European Christian settlers, often many of whom did share some anti-Semitic and at times anti-Islamic views as well. But be that as it may, Lacache in his report to the Jewish Chronicle records the fascinating words of someone he knew, Mohammed el-Aqsa. And he said to him, and I think these are beautiful words, and I'll just read the bit in red. Both of us are sons of Abraham. Both of us have sprung from the same loins. Then again, you were in the war at the front, and I was there too. So it's looking at common French service in the First World War. You were in the trenches, and so was I. In those days, no one called you a dirty Jew, and no one called me a dirty Arab. We were Frenchmen like the rest, lighters like our fellow soldiers. So again, this idea, we promise you, you can rely on us even unto death, that whatever goes on, however much the Nazis, the Italian fascists try and break those bonds, it won't work, or it won't work in all of the population. And there were even hopes within Anglo Jewry that even the groups that had overtly supported pro-Nazi propaganda, so in the Young Egypt group led by Ahmed Hussein in Egypt, where they were expressed often public sentiments of sympathy for the Germany and Italy and their fascist regimes, they said, actually, we're growing disillusioned. That actually there's something about Nazi philosophy that we as Muslims in Islam could never embrace. It may be that when they heard about Kristallnacht, the November pogrom in November 38, that may have had an impact, but we may come back to that later. So there's an international context where Anglo Jewry is looking and hoping that whatever's going on will not permanently damage those Jewish-Muslim relations. And I just wanted to kind of, before I go back to Anglo Jewry, and I think I'm okay for time, but this is a fascinating story. And I wanted to show you the international links between sort of Jews and Muslims who literally from Berlin to Woking. On the left, you see a picture of a fascinating German Jewish convert to Islam called Hugo Hamid Marcus. He converted to Islam officially in 1925. He was very involved in sort of scientific movements. He was essentially he campaigned for a liberalization to laws against homosexuality. He worked with Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was sort of how can I put this? He was an expert on aspects of science, kind of with a sexual leaning. And Marcus converted to Islam and became very much part of the Ahmadiyya community in Berlin. He often gave talks. He was a prolific writer, a tremendous intellect. And then 1933 comes. And there's something fascinating that even when Marcus converted to Islam, he never renounced his membership of the Jewish community. So there's a real hybrid nature of his identity. But be that as it may, one of the imams in the Berlin mosque where Hugo Marcus was very well known was Dr. S.M. Abdullah, who eventually comes from Berlin to Woking. And on the night of the November pogrom, by now, Marcus has officially left the Jewish community, but racially, according to the Nazis, you may identify yourself, they said, as a Muslim, but you are a Jew. He's arrested on the night of the November pogrom, and he's interned in Sachsenhausen. Dr. Abdullah finds out that he's in Sachsenhausen. And may I also say that this is complicated because since 1933, some of the kind of Muslim institutes in Berlin have tried to make themselves at least acceptable to the Nazi regime. So some of the more liberal materials from the 1920s have been refined. That there's been a hardening slightly of attitudes towards Jews. And Marcus himself was marginalized to some extent. There were still individual contacts with Hugo Marcus, but what happened, Dr. Abdullah intercedes basically to try and get him out of Sachsenhausen, and he negotiates a place for him, a visa for him to go to British India. In the end, there is something absolutely fascinating. Marcus, although his life's in danger, he refuses to leave Germany until he's finished his translation of the Quran into German and with some commentary. Eventually, in the summer of 39, before the outbreak of war, Marcus goes to Switzerland in the end because he felt the climate in India wouldn't be suitable for him, and survives the war there in the most fascinating of circumstances of identity. Why do I say this? Because one, it's Dr. Abdullah now, 1939, comes back to Britain, and he starts working at the Woking Mosque alongside Imam Abdul Majid, who we're going to come back to. And what you can see here is that the context has a tremendous influence. That Dr. Abdullah wrote in the Islamic Review, the Woking Mosque sort of in-house journal in 1939. You can see a slight hardening here that's quite different to that of Abdul Majid. So he gives a little bit of credence to the idea of what you may call the stab in the back theory, that German Jews and others did sort of damage the German war effort in the First World War. So he does refer to somewhat reasonably that the German persecution of the Jews is the result of Jewish treachery during the Great War. But he does say, but that cannot justify the terrible tide of anti-Semitism. But what we see here is a slightly harder attitude, but it's one I would argue that didn't predominate and then got softened and toned down again. Because he says, you know what? We look at the situation in Palestine, the Jews there should be grateful for the way that they've been treated under Muslim rule, whether that's under Spain or the Ottomans. And, you know, he says, we Muslims, we gave them shelter when they were persecuted by Christians. And now they're actually trying to stifle Arab demands in Palestine. So there's this sense of Jewish ingratitude. There's this idea that perhaps some of these Zionists, that they have a sense of ingratitude for what we as Muslims have done, and maybe they need to change their attitude. So that was probably one of the strongest articles I've seen of Dr. Abdullah, and I would say that it's there, but it's not typical, because what we're about to see, I would say, is much more typical of the overall attitude. Absolutely fascinating. If you see there on the right, there is a front page from the Jewish Chronicle from June 1940, and you'll see that in the bottom right, there is a little column, front page, why Muslims are anti-Nazi. And this was produced by none other than Imam Majid of the Woking Mosque, colleague of Dr. Abdullah, but he'd been there a lot longer. Dr. Abdullah's just moved a year earlier from Germany. And essentially, he was responding to this idea of, well, we can see that some parts of the Arab world seem enthused by Nazi and fascist messages, but actually what Imam Majid said is, Islam and the Muslim world, we are unmistakably against Nazism. We back the British fight against Nazi Germany and her allies. And not only that, he was invited to a Rotary Club with a lot of Jewish members in June 1940. And he said, fascinatingly, he said, the Quran orders Muslims to protect churches and synagogues as well as mosques. And when we saw what the Nazis did, probably referring to the November pogrom, this cemented our thing that Nazism is anathema to Islam. Not only that, but Nazi teaching is anathema to racial theory, is anathema to what Islam teaches about equality under God, etc. And Reverend Halpern, again, a fascinating comment, which you see the political context cannot be taken out, who gives a vote of thanks. And he says, you know, it's a pleasure to hear you, Imam Majid, thanks for coming. And he says, maybe one of the only good things coming out of the war, and this is 1940, so we're not yet into what I may call the actual official start of the Holocaust. He says, is the gradual approachment of Jews and Arabs in Palestine united against a common foe. And this was very contentious because, of course, in 1939, the white paper had been issued that restricted Jewish immigration into Palestine for 75,000, because the British political leaders said, well, the Jews are going to have to fight with us come what may. But actually, looking at perhaps the 3 years of putting down Arab revolt, they thought, well, actually, we cannot take Arab support for granted. So again, there's a lot of political things under that. But just look at that. The fact is that during the war, there's that coming together, there's that solidarity and coalescence that we Jews and Muslims, we are anti-Nazi together. Now, I will be finishing in a minute, and I hope I've not over-bombarded you with sources and everything, but I couldn't finish without just referring to something I found in August. I was sat in the London Metropolitan Archives, and I was looking in some folders from the Board of Deputies that essentially were folders that were looking at correspondence between Board of Deputies in London and Muslim majority countries in North Africa. Just a tiny bit of context. So essentially, from 1940, the Vichy France regime that came to power, anti-Jewish laws were fully implemented in Algeria because it was part of the French metropole. Essentially, the equivalent of the Nuremberg laws was applied to Algeria, to the 100,000 plus Jews that were living there. It's very complicated militarily, but by 1943, as a result of Operation Torch, essentially the Allies are in the ascendancy, but the authorities, particularly the French authorities, were very slow in cancelling anti-Jewish laws. And the Board of Deputies had a representative within the British Army who was representing the British Army in Algeria. And he sent regular correspondence back to London. And I just wanted to kind of end with this because I think this is fascinating in terms of sort of looking at wider kind of Muslim responses during the period of the Holocaust. And again, this is a complex topic. It varies from place to place, but I just wanted to end you with this. So, dear Mr. Brotman, this is the secretary of the board back in London. My last lesson, the conditions I described only applied to Algeria, as the Sultan of Morocco and the Bey of Tunis are both very friendly towards the Jews. It's only in Algeria there are anti-Jewish laws. Now, technically speaking, he's not entirely factually true, because the Sultan of Morocco, who became the future King Mohammed, and the Monsef Bey of Tunis, they weren't in charge. The French authorities were in charge, so they did have to rubber stamp some anti-Jewish decrees, but very often through their own personal actions, they tried to mitigate them. Soller writes, but to Soller, who is a British Jew, as I say, in Algeria, he writes back a few days later to Brotman, and he says, talking about the French Vichy sympathizers who do not want the anti-Jewish laws lifted, they actually think it keeps Jews in their place. It says, it does not mean, whatever the past, that such attitudes exist among the Muslims who are more friendly with the Jews than ever in history. Now, I didn't underline that. That was de Soller in his original letter. He felt this was a significant, he underlined it. He wanted London to see this. I've spoken to Muslim leaders and will send you copies of letters from them. And then finally, and I have got more, but I don't want to over bombard you. Finally, 4 days later, I have assurances from the Arab community they do not desire the Jews to lose their citizenship, because under the Crémieux Decree of 1870, the Jews basically were given full, Algerian Jews who could sort of speak French and other things were given full citizenship. This didn't always apply to Muslims. It was a kind of a patchy process. And he says, I will send you copies of letters from various muftis and qadis on the subject. The Muslims will not object to our rights in any way. Because essentially what he's saying is, how does it benefit Muslims for us to suffer? It doesn't, because if that's what the French can do to Jews, they can also do that to Muslims as well. And actually, there's that sense of solidarity. And to finish, what I wanted to say is that I've tried to put this in the context of Anglo Jewry, but you cannot look at Anglo Jewry without considering a very complex and constantly shifting international situation. But in summary, at a time where politically Jewish-Arab relations get worse from the late 20s through the 30s, and we see the proliferation of Nazi and other fascist propaganda. You've also got Mussolini proclaiming himself as the protector of Islam. We see Anglo Jewry were very concerned about this, but they highlighted voices within international Muslim communities that this was not going to disrupt that sense of solidarity. Whether we accept the sort of Jewish-Muslim symbiosis of the past in full, in part, of course, with all these things, there are nuances. We have to say that the Anglo-Jewish Muslim experiences of the 30s are a real testament to several things. They're a testament of minorities coming together for common goals and common humanity. But I think they're also contemporarily very relevant, because as Reverend Swift of the St. John's Wood Synagogue said, you know, we look at international events. Why should that damage the relationships on our doorstep? What happens abroad, we can't forget it. We know it has political ramifications, but we here on a local level can try and find things to transcend that. With that, I will finish. I'm sorry if I've gone over, and thank you so much for listening.